Medieval castles were incredibly cold. Not just cold enough to make you want an extra blanket, but so cold you could see your breath indoors. These were stone structures built to withstand sieges, not to provide comfort. There was no central heating, no radiators, and certainly no cozy down comforters or heated mattress pads. So how did they do it? How did people in these frozen fortresses sleep through the night without turning into human popsicles? Today, we will step into the dark and cold of the past to understand how medieval people not only endured, but survived the frigid winter nights. When we picture a castle, we often think of the warm glow of candlelight on tapestries, feasts in the great hall, and nobles relaxing in fur-lined robes. But the truth is that most castles were brutally harsh at night, especially in winter. Behind those thick stone walls was a world colder than a winter forest. There was no insulation, no double-paned windows, just bare stone and wind whistling through the cracks like a warning. Sleeping in a castle wasn't romantic. It was a nightly struggle, and surviving the cold was just as important as surviving your enemies. The problem of stone and design. The fundamental problem with a castle lay in its building material, stone. Stone was chosen for a good reason. It was fireproof, durable, and could withstand arrows and battering rams. However, it is an extremely poor insulator. Unlike wood or mud brick, stone absorbs cold like a sponge, and once it's cold, it stays that way for hours, even days. Even if you lit a fire in the room, the warmth would vanish as soon as the flames died down. Now, imagine thick stone walls, sometimes up to 10 feet deep, surrounding you on all sides. The ceilings are high, the windows are small, if they exist at all. There are no carpets and no insulation. There is only cold stone echoing your footsteps, radiating the chill of the earth itself. The layout of the castle didn't help either. The great halls were vast, open spaces. Bedrooms were often located in high towers, where the wind blew strongest. Spiral staircases acted as wind tunnels, and the only thing that might stop a midnight draft was a heavy wooden door and a tapestry, if you could afford one. In short, castles were built to keep enemies out, not to keep heat in. Most rooms were not sealed, allowing drafts to creep in from every direction. The large, open courtyards let the wind blow directly into the heart of the castle. So at night, when the sun set and the fires weakened, the cold became a silent invader. Invisible, unstoppable, and ever-present. Fire, smoke, and temporary solutions. In most medieval castles, the closest thing to a heating system was an open hearth. If you were lucky, it was a large stone fireplace. If not, just a small fire pit in the middle of the room. These hearths were incredibly inefficient. They filled the air with smoke and could barely heat the space immediately around them, let alone an entire room with a 20-foot ceiling. Worse yet, before the 12th century, chimneys did not exist. The smoke simply rose, hoping to escape through holes in the walls or ceiling. Most of it remained trapped inside. So what did they do? They relied on fires in the bedrooms, called chamber fireplaces, but only the wealthy had these. Servants and lower-ranking members of the household often slept in cold, unheated rooms, or even in the hallways. Those with more means used portable bronze braziers, metal bowls filled with hot coals. They could warm a room slightly, but came with the danger of fire. Fires were common, and beyond the risk of being burned, was the toxic smoke. More than a few people in medieval history died not from freezing, but from carbon monoxide poisoning in a poorly ventilated room. Still, the hearths burned, the fires crackled, and for a brief moment, warmth returned. Just enough for you to take off your shoes and pray for morning to come quickly. The survival weapon, the four-poster bed. Now we come to the true survival weapon of the Middle Ages, the curtained bed. This was not just luxurious royal furniture. The four-poster bed, with its thick curtains, existed for one reason only: to keep warm. Imagine a tent inside a stone room, enclosed by multiple layers of thick fabric. That's what these beds were. The curtains were not for decoration, but were entirely functional. At night, you would draw them shut, isolating yourself from the rest of the freezing room. The heat from your body, and perhaps one or two others, was trapped inside this fabric cocoon. Wealthier families would line their curtains with wool or fur. Some even used thick, felted wool blankets as heavy as carpets to enhance insulation. The bed itself was raised, sometimes several feet off the cold floor, to avoid the drafts that ran along the stone. The mattress was a sack filled with straw or feathers. Not exactly memory foam, but it kept you warm, and most importantly, dry. Families often slept together, 2, 3, even 4 to a bed. Children slept with their siblings, servants with other servants. Warmth was more important than personal space. You didn't sleep, stretched out, but curled up, knees to your chest, hands tucked in. It wasn't about comfort. It was about heat conservation. And once you were in, you didn't get out until morning. The silent role of the servant. Surviving a night in a castle was not something you could do alone, especially if you were a noble. This is where the servants, specifically the chamber servants, came in. These men and women had one goal: to ensure their masters did not freeze. They did this in ways that were both clever and exhausting. First, they would prepare the bedroom hours before bedtime. A servant would build the fire, bring in coals, and set up the portable brazier. They would heat flat stones by the fire and then slip them into the mattress to pre-warm it. They boiled water, poured it into metal bottles or ceramic jugs, wrapped them in cloth, and placed them under the bed sheets like medieval hot water bottles. Next came the blankets. Thick wool, sometimes fur, and always layered. The servant would fluff the mattress, smooth the linen sheets, if you had them, and fold extra blankets at the foot of the bed. And then they stayed in the room all night, listening, waiting, sometimes dozing on a chair near the door. Why? To add more coals to the brazier, add logs to the fire, bring warm water if needed, or fetch another blanket if their master stirred. Their work didn't end when their master fell asleep. In many ways, that's when it began. Even nobles were not immune to the cold. Chronic coughs, arthritis, winter fevers. The best remedy was not a doctor, but a competent servant with a stack of warm stones and a pot of mulled wine. Some noble women even had warming stools, wooden frames lined with iron, filled with hot coals. They would sit on them while saying their evening prayers or reading. Others wrapped their feet in sheepskin or wore fur-lined boots that never left their bedside. In short, one person's comfort was often built on the labor of 3 or 4 others. The irony of the cold. You might think the nobility had it better when it came to staying warm, and in some ways they did. Bigger beds, thicker blankets, private fireplaces. But there was an irony. The castle's architecture often made their rooms colder. The nobles' bedrooms were on the upper floors of the towers, farther from the natural warmth of the earth, more exposed to the wind, and often built with large windows to show off their wealth. These windows, of course, had no glass. At best, they had wooden shutters or a thin layer of oiled cloth. So while the lords and ladies had servants to light their fires and warm their beds, the cold still found them, sometimes worse than the poor sleeping below. Servants, guards, and kitchen boys often slept near the hearths in the basement or in the inner quarters, where the stone retained some of the day's warmth. Some even curled up next to the livestock in the castle stables, because body heat, whether from a cow or a cousin, was better than nothing. In castles, warmth came from location, not luxury. And in that irony lies the truth. The cold did not respect rank. It seeped through stone, slipped through cracks, and chilled everyone equally, unless you were lucky enough to sleep above a bakery. The true survivors. Now, let's talk about the true survivors. The ones who didn't even get to lie down. The night watchmen. These men stood guard along the battlements, gatehouses, and watchtowers. They weren't soldiers in shining armor. They were often young, underfed men, wrapped in layers of patched wool. Their job? Don't fall asleep. Don't freeze. Don't die. They patrolled the walls, stood watch for hours, and sat on stone benches with a knife-sharp wind cutting through the arrow slits. There were no fireplaces, no beds, just the occasional torch, and even that was rare. So how did they survive? They moved constantly, stomping their feet, swinging their arms, huddling together like birds on a branch. Some chewed on dried cloves or strong herbs to stay awake. Others whispered prayers with every breath, hoping the sun would rise faster. Sometimes they changed shifts every 2 hours, sometimes not. A few castles had braziers near the guard posts, but carrying one up a spiral staircase was risky and cumbersome. Many guards wrapped hot stones in cloth and tucked them under their cloaks. Others carried flasks of spiced wine or ale, not to get drunk, but to keep the blood moving. The alcohol didn't warm them, but it made them forget the cold. And if they failed, if they fell asleep, if they left their post, the punishment could be swift. For them, the cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a test you could not fail. Because if you fell asleep and the enemy got in, everyone would pay the price. The legacy of endurance. So how did people sleep in medieval castles without freezing to death? The answer is, they barely did. They didn't sleep in comfort. They slept in layers of clothing, in groups, in silence, and in fear of the frigid drafts that poured down the tower stairs like ghosts. They burned smoky fires, carried hot stones, and drew their bed curtains to fight off the cold. They relied on servants for warmth, on animals for shared body heat, and on each other for endurance. Still, some did not make it. Death in winter was common. A fever could become a fatal illness. Catching a cold in a medieval castle was often a death sentence. But they endured, because that's what humans do. They adapted. They wrapped themselves in everything they could find: wool, animal skins, tradition, and ritual. And they passed those survival tips down from one generation to the next, through every cold night. The cold in a medieval castle was unlike any winter you have experienced today. It wasn't just a negative number on a thermometer. It was something that seeped into every finger and toe, soaked into your bones, made your joints stiffen, and turned your breath into thin wisps of mist floating from your lips. It stayed with you from sunset to sunrise, without loosening its grip, without mercy. At night, when all the fires in the great hall had died down and darkness covered everything, the cold began to speak in its own language. The sound of the wind whistling through the door cracks like a deterrent. The sound of stone creaking softly under the pressure of changing temperatures, and the sound of a dry cough from someone curled up in a worn wool blanket. For the elderly, it brought a persistent ache in the joints. For children, it was the first challenge of life, learning to sleep without crying when their feet were numb. For servants, it was an endless task, keeping the fire alive, keeping their masters safe, sometimes forgetting about themselves. And for the guards, it was a silent enemy, standing shoulder to shoulder with the invader, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. Yet, amidst this harshness, people still found a way to stand firm. They knew the coals would burn out. The blankets wouldn't be thick enough. The windows wouldn't be sealed enough. But they still lit the fire. They knew that every morning they would have to face another long day in the cold. But they still tied their shoes and went to work. The cold made everything slow down, made the body want to give up. But it was then that the motivation became truly clear. Keep the family safe. Keep the fire in the kitchen. Keep yourself alive for one more night. A mother would wrap her child to her chest, letting herself get colder to keep her child warmer. A father would go out to guard the walls, knowing that each patrol was a shield protecting those inside. A servant would doze by the fireplace, only to wake up at the sound of their master turning over, then add more coals, more blankets, another hot water bottle. There were nights when the wind blew so hard that even the torches went out, and darkness swallowed every direction. Yet people continued to walk, continued to wait, because they understood that, in this place, weakness didn't just make you miserable. It could put the entire community in danger. Motivation didn't come from ease, but from connection. You tried not just for yourself, but for the person next to you. The person next to you tried for someone else. And that circle continued to spread, keeping the entire castle standing against the cold and all dangers. Perhaps this is what created the resilience of the people of that time. Not because they had the best clothes or the biggest fireplaces, but because they learned to share warmth, learned to sleep close together, learned to use whatever they could to hold on to a little bit of remaining heat. Every morning, when the sun rose and the pale yellow light filtered through the cracks in the wooden shutters, you would see a small miracle. People were still here. The fire was still burning in the kitchen. The sounds of conversation, footsteps, and a spoon stirring porridge still echoed. Another night had passed, and life, no matter how cold, went on. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson that the stone walls of medieval castles want to tell us. You can't always make things easier, but you can always make yourself stronger. And sometimes, that alone is enough to get through the longest winter. So, the next time you pull a blanket over your shoulders or turn up the heat, remember that somewhere in the past, someone tried to sleep on stone, with smoke in their lungs and their breath freezing. And they did it, not because they were warm, but because they were determined. And sometimes, That alone is enough.